Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Real Science Exchange, the pubcast where leading scientists and industry professionals meet over a few drinks to discuss the latest ideas and trends in animal nutrition. Hi, I'm Scott Sorrell, your host tonight. We're going to take a deep dive into a webinar topic from earlier this year. We've joined by Dr. Jeff Dahl from the University of Florida to discuss the key elements of his presentation titled, Beat the Heat Before It Beats You. And if you'd like to listen or watch that webinar, go to balchem.com/realscience and scroll down until you see the presentation presented on April 1st, 2025. It'll just be a few down. But before we dive in, I'd like to give a warm welcome to our honored guest, Dr. Jeff Dahl. Jeff, thank you for joining us here once again here at the Real Science Exchange.
Thanks, Scott. Pleasure to be here. Really appreciate the invitation.
No worries. If you wouldn't mind, could you give our audience, for those folks that may not know you, just a little bit of background on yourself?
Sure. Professor at the Department of Animal Sciences, the University of Florida. Been here about 19 years. Have done a lot of work in the area of heat stress, particularly heat stress of animals in late gestation. So dry period heat stress, the impacts on the cow, and then the impacts on the calf as well.
All right, very well. Now, I see you've brought a guest with you to the pub. Would you mind introducing your special guest that you brought with you?
Sure. This is Dr. Tao, and he is at the University of Georgia. And Shah had the extreme pleasure of doing his PhD with me, right, Shah? You're supposed to
very much
head up and down. Much. Very good, very good. And actually generated some of our initial work related to the effects of heat stress on late gestation cows, and particularly impacts on metabolism in the cow, but also impacts on mammary development and the effects on the calf. So quite a bit of the early work, the sort of foundational work, was done as a part of his dissertation.
Oh, excellent. Well, Shah, thank you for joining us tonight. Now, this is your first trip to the pub, and it truly is a pub. We say it's a virtual pub with real drinks. And I understand you're quite the wine connoisseur, and there may be a story behind that. Jeff?
Well, wait, just want to introduce myself a little bit more. I'm originally from China, and so had the pleasure to work with Dr. Dahl during my PhD, and also a couple years postdoc. So I moved to Georgia about 11 years ago. In the first 7 years, I was at Tifton, Georgia, and now 4 years ago, we relocated to Athens, Georgia. So been here for a long time. So for the wine story, so actually it's happened during the graduate school. In China, we have this kind of called alcohol, not necessarily wine. So people like, and
it's called baijiu, right?
It's like yes, exactly. So it's normally have a high degree. So I did share this with Dr. Dahl and Dr. Jose Santos. They seems to really like it,
So, we said that it was a bit of a misnomer because most of the time, I mean, even sort of the strongest sort of red wine that I might have had, a heavy Bordeaux or something, as I bring the glass to my mouth and nose, I don't feel water sucking out of epithelial cells, whereas this wine did that.
No.
Yeah. So
absolutely, I've had it. That stuff is rocket fuel. Yeah, it really is.
Right. I remember. I forgot either Dr. Dahl or Dr. Santos comment on that. So we put that into tractor. Tractor can run. So
we blend
true
that.
Story.
That's what all the ethanol plants produce in the Midwest.
Right.
Yeah. Well, good story. Well, welcome, Shah. We appreciate having you tonight. Looking forward to the conversation. Finally, want to welcome a familiar face back to the podcast. My co-host tonight, Laura Nihus. Welcome, Laura. Appreciate you joining us once again. And I understand that you have failed me. You did not bring a drink with you tonight, but that's all right. I will drink alone. I'm not alone, but I will drink. And so before we get started, what I'd like to do is just raise our glass to beating heat stress and to some great guests. Gumbai.
Thanks, Scott.
That's what they say in China.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Very good.
New research is changing everything we thought we knew about choline's impact on the cow and her calf, and top scientists have a lot to say about it. They are presenting new research that supports choline as a required nutrient to optimize milk production, choline as a required nutrient to support a healthy transition, choline as a required nutrient to improve calf health and growth, and choline as a required nutrient to increase colostrum quantity. This new research is solidifying choline's role as a required nutrient for essentially every cow, regardless of health status, milk production level, or body condition score. Learn more about the science that is changing the game and the choline source that is making it happen. Reassure precision-release choline from Balchem. Visit balchem.com/scientistsay to learn more.
Dr. Dahl, I'm going to jump right in. Before we get started, and I kind of asked you a question similar to this prior to the lecture, but a lot of your presentation dealt with the dry cow. And I'm kind of curious, you're a well-traveled fellow. In fact, when you did the webinar, you were in France. But how much attention are producers today, paying attention to cooling those dry cows? I know they're cooling their lactating cows, but are they paying a lot of attention to drying those dry cow or cooling those dry cows?
I think it's very geographically dependent.
Okay.
I would say in Florida, Tao, you tell me in Georgia, I think most of our cows, because I'm going to go, we have it probably also by size of farm. Larger farms are doing a better job at getting all of their cows cooled effectively kind of year round. But as we move further north, we're seeing less. And I would say, even to your comment that the lactating cows are getting cooled, I'm not sure that they're all getting cooled effectively. We don't typically think of Maine as a very balmy place in April. It was 80 degrees. And we went through the lactating cow pens, and there were cows there whose respiration rate was well into the 60s, right? These cows are already experiencing heat stress, and that was at the beginning of April. I think that just emphasizes the importance of this, but I don't think that we've done as well as we should have in getting the message out and getting information to people so that they get their cows cooled throughout the life cycle, really. I mean, it's got to be from lactation, well, before the first lactation, because we've shown that with first calf heifers, but all the way through lactation, then the dry period, and they always need access to cooling. And I think that there's a lot of room for improvement, particularly as we head further north.
Yeah. You were saying education maybe as part of it's going to ask you that. Is it education maybe just the fact that maybe up north they don't really think they have heat stress, or if it's not purely defined? Just kind of curious about the objections to it.
Well, I think there's a couple of things. First, cows get heat stress a long time before we feel heat stressed. I don't think that walking around on those farms, most of the folks that were with me felt heat stressed, but cows, remember, have that that rumen that's generating a lot of heat, and so they get heat stressed before we do. And the sort of additional sort of thought to that is, typically, when people say, well, we only get a couple of weeks of hot weather in the summer, they're thinking about the worst sort of weather that they get. And they're usually moving from an air-conditioned house to an air-conditioned vehicle to an air-conditioned office at the farm. The cow is always out in the non-air-conditioned barn. And so part of it is that sort of, we're not the same as a cow, and we don't get heat stressed as soon as they do. The other big concern that people have is that we usually talk about fans and soakers as the most effective mechanism for getting cows cooled, particularly as we get into more humid environments. And there's a limitation in a lot of places on the amount of water that they can add, and there are concerns about the amount of water that they add to their manure handling system.
Yeah.
We've done some work recently with soakers that, rather than sort of coming on every 5 minutes, whether there's a cow there or not, activating only when there's a cow in front of them, they use a lot less water. In fact, the first study that we did with them, we had 3 groups of animals, cows that were cooled with our conventional soaker and fan arrangement. We had cows that were heat stressed, so they had no soakers and fans. And then we had cows with these smart soakers. And we looked at the total amount of water that was consumed by the cows on all those treatments and the total amount of water that went through the soaking system. And by far, the greatest water use was in the cows that were cooled with our conventional system. Okay. But when we looked at the total amount of water, so drinking and through the cooling system, it didn't differ for the smart soakers and the heat stress cows, even though the smart soakers got them cooled just as effectively as our conventional system. And so cows drink more water when they're heat stressed. And so you're adding water no matter what. So the takeaway from that for me is we're a lot better off putting some extra water on their backs to cool them off than trying to let them cool themselves sort of by having water flow through them.
Yeah. Shaw, Jeff said that he was in Maine and he saw some cows panting. Is that the best way to know that you've got heat stress? Are there other signals, or can it be kind of subclinical and you not really know that they're heat stressed? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, so I think Dr. is right. So if you will look at the animal-based indicator, the respiration rate is the first, the increased respiration rate is the first indicator of the heat stress. So it happens before the increase the body temperature. So if we are focusing on the cows, so we really should pay attention on respiration rate. But reality is not everybody try to focus on the cows. People still look at the air temperature or THI. So in a lot of systems, at least here in Georgia, people still kind of use air temperature to decide when to turn on the fans or turn on the waters. So I think moving forward, I think this precision cooling, we can actually incorporate the animal-based indicator to like more accurately identify heat stress on an individual cow basis. And the respiration rate clearly is, I personally think, is the indicator we should look for.
Yeah. Can they be under heat stress and not show any symptoms or behaviors?
What do you mean? Sorry.
So can they not be panting and still be under heat stress?
Well, there is some cow variation, but in general, once they are under heat stress, the first sign is the increased respiration rate. Unless this cow will have extreme exposed to, or they carry extreme amount of heat load, so their respiration rate could plateau. But that's probably is very dangerous. But initially, so almost every single cow will have increased the respiration rate.
Yeah. Jeff, during your presentation, again, you focused a lot on that dry cow, and I was pretty amazed at all the different ways that the animal and the offspring is impacted by heat during the dry period. Would you mind kind of giving us a treetop overview of the presentation and some of those things that some of those bad things caused by heat stress?
Yeah, well, there are no good things.
Okay, true.
We can start there. That list is non-existent, so it's only bad things or no effect. I mean, during the dry period, I guess you could say, and this goes back to some of Shah's work during his PhD, we don't see gross metabolic changes other than there's definitely a reduction in dry matter intake in the heat stress cows versus the cooled cows. But, in terms of looking at insulin, glucose, NEFAs, other indicators of metabolism or metabolic shifts, there's not much that's going on in those animals during acute heat stress when they're dry, which kind of makes sense, right? They're at a lower level of intake. Even though they're at that lower level, they have a reduction in intake, but they're able to manage that metabolically pretty easily. But that said, there are dramatic shifts in their immune function and how they respond, particularly to things like vaccinations. And so that's always an area that we want to pay attention to. There's also effects on mammary development and redevelopment in those cows. So that's what sort of sets the stage for lower productivity in that next lactation and is consistent with it being an effect that's sort of programmed in for that subsequent lactation. And then there are lots of negative impacts on the calf. Not so that you would think it's as severe as it ends up being, because the calves are obviously fairly well developed at that point when the heat stress starts. In our studies, at least, because we started at the dry off phase and then all the way through the dry period. But the animals that are born to those heat stress dams are challenged from a growth standpoint. They're challenged from an organ development standpoint, particularly the mammary gland, the ovaries, and the immune organs in those animals are all challenged. And it means that fewer of those animals make it through their first lactation. They're not as productive, and they have a phenotype that then is actually passed on to their offspring and is a poorer production and survival phenotype as well. So it's a great example of epigenetic or placental programming in these fetal programming in these animals when they experience heat stress late in gestation.
So impact on 3 generations.
At least.
At least. Wow. So turning around the impact of heat stress in a herd may take years, will take years.
Yeah, because what you've essentially established is a lower baseline to start from.
Yeah.
I like to think of it as we're seeing the extremes of an animal's potential, their genetic potential. And this is one insult that can push that down so that she is not able to express her full genetic potential. And the animals that are coming from cooled dams, of course, they are able to more fully express their genetic potential. Yeah, and it'll take, you can't reverse it in those animals, and you can't necessarily reverse it in their offspring, but you can sort of lose less ground going forward.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Tao, can you talk a little bit about, do you have to cool animals during the whole dry period, or can you just do it in the close-up period? Have we taken a look at that? Is there any research on that?
I think it's a great question. So if you go to a lot of farms, at least in this part of the country, so most of the farms, they have barns and provide cooling to the close-up cows. But a lot of times, the far-off cows are still on the pasture. They may have shade from the tree. Even in Georgia, I believe in Florida too, a lot of farms still using this type of model to raise dry cows. I think Dr. Dahl's group, I think several years ago, did a really nice study to look at cooling at different stage of the dry period on the cow's productivity. For instance, cooling only during the far off and the cooling only during the close up. I think the conclusion here is that if we want to get the full benefit of cooling dry cows, we need to cool cows from dry off to the calving. So basically, we want to cool the entire dry period. So to get the full benefit. So only cooling close up or only cooling far off. So if you look at data, sometimes only cooling during the close up, sometimes some studies show some improvement in productivity, but at least in Dr. study, so only cooling during the close up did not actually improve milk production in the subsequent lactation. So we want to cool the entire dry period. Sometimes it's a challenge to convince producer to do that. But with every time we talk with producer, we try to tell them, so we want to cool the entire dry period, not just the close up. Yeah.
Okay. And what about heifers, right? They don't have a dry period. Do we cool them in late lactation? And if so, how long? 60 days? Do we have an idea there?
So if we look at data, so for example, I know Brittany, who worked with Dr. Dahl and Dr. Laporta before, they did a study in Florida to look at cooling pregnant heifers in the last 2 months of gestation, and they pick up really nice improvement in the milk production in the subsequent lactation. And to my knowledge, so there are only probably 2 studies has been done to look at cooling the heifers, pregnant heifers in the last months of the gestation. And these 2 studies are actually from 2 theses at the University of Florida. So the data between these 2 studies, the result is not quite consistent, but at least one of the study see some benefit by cooling the heifers only during the last months of gestation. However, this type of that increase in milk production is much smaller compared with Brittany's data. So basically, if you want to get a full benefit by cooling heifers, pregnant heifers, so we want to cool 2 months, at least the last 2 months of the gestation.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that's exactly the difference that we saw between those 2 studies is that the other one, it was for a shorter time period that those animals were cooled. And, if you think about the sort of placental mechanisms at work here, and, the placenta is not just there to support the calves development. The placenta also provides the hormonal support for mammary development in those animals. And so, we've shown now that placental function is really impacted by this heat stress. And so the longer time period that you have sort of full placental function, the better off at least we interpret it as that better off those animals are going to be from a mammary development standpoint and then from a productivity standpoint.
Yeah.
So going along, I was going to ask a question going along the same idea of the heifers. And I know that producers probably aren't going to love this question because at this point we're saying just cool everything. But we have a ton of mammary development that happens in these calves and as they're growing before they even get pregnant. Has there been any research in calves that say aren't from heat stress dams, but are heat stressed as they're growing and growing that mammary gland? Do we see negative impacts there, or are we less involved at that point?
I'm going to let Shaw take that one.
Okay. So I think a lot of research is happening right now on the neonatal calf side. So basically during the pre-weaning period. So, but most of the research has been done to look at the growth performance. So we collaborate with Dr. Laporta at Wisconsin. We just finished a study last year in Georgia to look at the cooling pre-wean dairy calves, how this could affect their future productivity. We have 168 calves in that experiment, and we provide cooling to these calves, and we try to, actually right now is following up with these animals, but to get data, we still need to wait about 2 years. So, but I know.
So we don't know yet.
But if you look at the published data and also some preliminary data, so the data is not very consistent. So I know Dr. Ricardo Chabel from Florida, they did a study in southern Georgia to look at the cooling pre-wean dairy calves and this impact on their future productivity. They actually did not pick up a positive response. But I also think it also depends on the cooling system. So how much you cool, and but essentially right now the study in this area is very, very limited. I do think we need to do more study to actually demonstrate the benefit about providing cooling to the animals, let's say from birth to pregnancy, or even in the early pregnancy. And to my knowledge, from heat stress standpoint, the study to look at how heat stress affect the mammary gland development and the future productivity during the pre-pubertal and post-pubertal period is lacking. At least to my knowledge, we don't have data to examine that or to look at how this affected the future production.
Yeah, I would say the only piece to add to that is that we have looked at sort of seasonal effects on productivity, and we're starting to look at that more in the calves. So we've looked at it primarily in season of birth and see dramatic differences in longevity, which is consistent with our sort of controlled heat stress studies. Now we're trying to pull out the calves that were born in and kind of look at how that's influencing their development. So the calves born to those animals and whether there's a persistent sort of impact on their development. Um, I think that there probably are some impacts of heat stress, just like there are on overall development. Those animals obviously have to use energy to get rid of that additional heat load. But you know, I don't know that we're going to see the sort of dramatic effects that we see from the in utero impacts in those animals, just because that's really setting the stage then for sort of, the next 22 months or so of development, in that calf, right? Until she comes in for the first time. And if we set her back, like we've shown in utero heat stress calves, then she's starting from, further back than the animals that are coming from cooled calves. And I don't know that they're ever going to be able to catch up. If we continue to heat stress them, it probably makes it worse, but I don't know that it's going to, sort of have as dramatic an impact as that initial insult.
Yep, that makes sense.
So there's a lot of impacts or positive impacts of cooling that dry cow. Probably the one that's going to show up the quickest is milk production. Can you talk a little bit about how much milk production, right, if you cool those cows effectively? Do you guys have any research or data that you can cite on that?
Well, I was just updating my summary slide the other day, as a matter of fact, and I was shocked when I put in the last couple of studies. I mean, it's still in the range of about across, and I think I've got probably 14 or 15 studies in there, many of them ours, but also studies from all over. One of the most recent ones was done down in Mexico, and it's in that 10 pound a day range in the next lactation, at least as far as how long they do it. And we've had studies that go, some of Shah's work went pretty much through the entire lactation where we followed those animals. And then you have other studies that might just go for the first 2 months or so. But most of them are going to be between that sort of 2 and 9 months of lactation duration. And we're seeing those kinds of averages. I would say that, conservatively 8 pounds a day drop for the lactation is a reasonable estimate to what those cows are going to have as far as a drag on their productivity in the next lactation. Shah, I don't know if you have other thoughts or whether you think that maybe it's a little lower, but I guess I'm trying to be conservative with the 8 pounds a day.
I think it's right. It's 8 to 10 pounds per day. If you look at percentage, about 15%. Or we can change this way. So if you cool the dry cows, you have about 15% increase in milk production. Pretty conservative. And I think the amazing thing is you look at Dr. Dahl mentioned about this summary. If you look at the summary, the study is not just from Florida; it's from all over the place in the last 40 years. So it's very conservative. So if we have this amount of evidence, so they definitely show it is very, very real and it is a huge impact. So yeah, it's about 8 to 10 pounds range.
Does it also impact colostrum volume and quality? Do we know anything about that?
You want to do that, Dr. Dahl?
Well, we could both do it, right? It certainly does. And Shah was one of the first to show that there are impacts on colostrum volume. We don't see really differences. I'm trying to think. I don't know that any of the studies have really shown a difference in Ig concentration in the heat stress cows versus the cooled cows, but what we see are volume differences. and we'll see lower volumes in the heat stress cows than we do in the control, in the cooled cows. We've looked at various aspects. There's definitely a drop in passive transfer in the animals that were heat stressed in utero versus the animals that were cooled, but that's not an effect on the colostrum, right? And we've looked at that pretty heavily and have shown now that it's actually an effect, a physical effect in those calves, that they have, whether you want to say not as developed or a more accelerated gut closure. You could say it either way. It results in the same thing, that their passive transfer and capacity for passive transfer is lower if they've been heat stressed in utero versus the animals that are coming from a cooled dam. And you can't overcome it. You can't reverse it after they're born. You can't give them more colostrum and expect them to have greater uptake. There is a limitation on their capacity for passive transfer, which sets the stage then for those animals having poorer health and poorer performance, poorer survival as they mature.
Now, do you think that continues? Just the early gut closure. So, do you think that then absorption of nutrients in that GI tract is an issue for the rest of their life, or is that something that was kind of just related to that early life colostrum absorption?
Your turn, Shah.
That's a hard one. So
that's why it's your turn.
There you work.
Well, I'm really not sure. So I think the research, although it's after 15 some years research, there's still a lot of things we don't know. But I think it's a very, very good question. And so the gut closure, so a lot of times we try to focus on the first 24 hours, and Dr. Dahl has a very strong evidence to show. So the heat stress calves, their gut, their enterocyte or their gut closure is faster, so that will limit the IgG or nutrient transport. In terms of the long-term impact, I don't know if we have enough evidence to support there is a long-term impact, but it could be. Yeah.
Yeah, I just don't think that we've been able to look at that sort of long-term sort of study or had enough animals to look at that.
Mm-hmm.
I will say that, surprisingly to me, perhaps not so surprisingly, but we see differences in growth in those animals. They're obviously, when they've been heat stressed in utero, they're born at a lower body weight. Their weaning weight is lower. Their lower weight still at a year of age, so around puberty, they still have a lower body weight than the animals that are from a cooled dam. But in that next year, if you just look at body weight, it looks like they catch up. So they're having some compensatory gain in that second year of life post-pubertally. And my suspicion is that the composition of gain is different. And I think that that's consistent with them having lower productivity later on, is that they've got less of a sort of ability to transfer nutrients and for lean mass accretion, but they probably have a difference in their body composition if they've been heat stressed in utero versus the animals that are cooled. So absorptively, you might not see differences, but where they're actually putting those calories may differ.
Interesting. So do you think potentially more lipid deposition?
That would be my speculation, yes.
Interesting.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of discussion about reproduction and heat stress, and tell me if I'm wrong, but my assumption is that a lot of that focus has been about cooling that cow during that pre-breeding period. Is that where the emphasis has been? And if so, I'm kind of curious. So cooling the dry cow, what kind of impact does that have on reproduction? And is it better to cool them during the dry period, or is it better to cool them when you're breeding them?
Well,
Dr. It's yours.
just in general, you asked me the $1 million question. You can only cool one group of cows on your farm. Who do you cool?
Mm-hmm.
And now I've decided that I just answer dry cows all the time, because the reason I say that is because the impacts that we see persist for the entire lactation. So if you're going to force me to only cool one group of cows, I'm still going to cool the dry cows, because I'm going to have, even if they're heat stressed in lactation, they're still going to do better than the animals that would have been heat stressed during the dry period, right? They're going to take a knock later on. And if we're talking about 8 to 10 pounds a day, that's significant from my perspective for the entire lactation.
Plus
But
the
going
next
back
few
to,
generations.
yeah, going back to your original question, Scott, I think that we've got evidence that there is a negative impact of heat stress during the dry period on reproductive function in those animals, and that data comes primarily from analysis of when animals were dry in either a hot season or a cool season. And what we observed was the animals that were dry during the hot season actually had poorer reproductive performance compared with the animals that were dry during the cooler season of the year. We have not had enough animals to look at that in our controlled studies, but all the indications are that those animals that are heat stressed when they're dry have poorer reproductive performance in that next lactation, even though, in that study, we're trying to get the cows bred during the cooler season, and yet they still had poorer reproductive performance. And the animals that did better were the ones that were trying to get bred during the acute heat stress effect during lactation. They still outperformed the other animals. So I think that the impacts on reproduction in the cow are definitely going to have, it's going to be a negative impact versus the animals that were cooled. And really, again, the dramatic effects, though, are in that calf, right? So there's some recent work that Imena is publishing, Imena Laporta, showing that the animals that were heat stressed in utero have poorer gonadal development, and we see that expressed as lower concentrations of anti-Müllerian hormone. That is an indicator of the follicular reserve, right? So calves are born, females are born with all the follicles they're going to have, right? And so the fact that they have lower AMH is consistent with lower follicular reserve and poorer reproductive performance for life. So it's not just on the sort of tail end or the end point of reproduction, lactation. It's also at the beginning that those animals suffer if they're heat stressed in utero.
Interesting. And the exact mode of action, you're speculating on what's happening there. I heard you talking before about cotyledon development. I saw some pictures during your presentation. Is that all part of it?
Yeah, so that's in the cow. We have now sort of zeroed in on differences in placental function with heat stress, and we see definite sort of morphological changes, very clear to the eye. We see about half the number of cotyledons, which are the sort of the calf side of the placentome, and a reduction in that was kind of surprising to us, but that's going to indicate poorer placental function in those animals that are heat stressed versus the animals that are cooled. That's obviously going to influence, again, hormonal output and overall function of the placenta, which has implications for the calf, but also has implications for the cow. Now, the exact mechanism whereby those cows are having poorer reproductive performance, that could just be a direct effect on their follicular development, right? Because that's still occurring in the animals, and they're kind of setting up the follicular output into that next lactation when they're being heat stressed. So it could just be residual impacts of the heat stress on those cows when they experience it in the dry period as they move into lactation, and then we're trying to get them bred.
So, Dr. Dahl, do you think are a lot of these issues that we're seeing, especially in the next lactation and then also in the calf, Are we not having these same negative impacts kind of starting to take place while the cow is still lactating and pregnant? Or are you really just seeing that it is a dry period problem where heat stress has the most impact?
Well, getting back to the idea that a lot of this comes back to the placenta and placental dysfunction, I think that the the impacts are going to be most severe later in gestation, right? Because just the development of that placenta and output of that placenta is going to be less. But certainly, there are probably some impacts of the heat stress in the previous lactation. Difficult to tease those out though, because we are doing a better job of getting lactating cows cooled.
Mm-hmm.
So that would overcome some of it. But how many cows I think that there are still many folks out there of the mindset that we dry them off, they kind of go on vacation for 2 months. Well, let me see. You've dried them off. You've moved them from a reasonable diet to sort of a low energy diet. You've taken them from a cooled environment and thrown them outside in the middle of summer with no shade. I'm not sure that this is really qualifying as vacation. So I think that that's where we start to see some of these impacts being even more sort of amplified later in gestation during the dry period.
And now I guess that kind of also brings the question, obviously this is having an impact on the mammary gland itself too, and involution is going on during the dry period. But what are you seeing change-wise? Do you see changes with involution itself occurring when cows are heat stressed versus cooled? Is it not as efficient?
Well, you're gonna take this one?
Sure. So, well, I think so. There's first during the dry period. So we do think involution is pretty critical. That can mediate the following mammary growth and influence the future milk production. Mm-hmm. Without the involution, for example, we continue to milk the quarter. Without involution, the mammary gland is gonna grow in the last month of the gestation, with or without mammary involution. But with mammary involution, so the mammary gland growth will be higher. So, which means the mammary involution can mediate some of the growth of the mammary gland, which will increase milk production of the next lactation. So, in terms of heat stress, we do think heat stress can actually suppress mammary involution, because heat stress can increase the prolactin and also can increase the heat shock protein. All these factors can actually depress the mammary apoptosis and also mammary autophagy during the first 2 weeks of the dry period. So when we depress the mammary involution, I do think that can have some consequences on the following mammary growth. So and also the future milk production. But in general, we do think the heat stress can suppress mammary involution. And I think we do have some results and some data to support that, particularly related to mammary apoptosis and also mammary autophagy. And heat stress do decrease mammary apoptosis and autophagy in the first 1 or 2 weeks of the dry period when the mammary involution occurs.
Yeah, Dr. Dahl, one of the things I found very interesting in the presentation was related to heat stress and cow longevity. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, this was a sort of a records analysis that we did, based on all of our controlled studies. It would indicate, and obviously we've got evidence from calves from those studies, that they just don't persist in the herd as long. They've got about, if you go out to 5 years of age, the first 3 lactations, the animals that were heat stressed in utero have about a year less time in the herd than the animals that were cooled. So that's obviously a potential impact on overall herd longevity. I don't have enough time left in my career to do a controlled study to look at this, but we did a records analysis from a couple of herds, pretty consistent high level management here in Florida, but also in California, and just asked the question, how many cows are in their later lactations, and is there a difference in terms of when those animals were born? And so cows that were in their 5th through their 8th lactation, right? So those are pretty persistent cows. Clearly, they have a lot of ability to sort of just perform. They've been more resistant to acquiring diseases, and they're still productive. We found in the Florida herd that about 3/4 of those animals were born in cooler months of the year versus the animals that were born in the hotter months of the year. And the pattern was similar in California, although not quite as extreme. But again, I don't think that we would see the same sort of extreme heat stress there. Not that it doesn't get very hot. I'm not arguing that, but it doesn't last as long. And there is probably some more night cooling, and that would be consistent when we looked at the average THI. It was actually lower, both from a peak during the day and the sort of low THI in the California situation versus what we'd see here in Florida. So to us, at least, that sort of is consistent with our controlled studies that, if a calf is heat stressed in utero, she's not going to last as long in the herd and doesn't have the potential to last as long. And so, as longevity, and we're debating, is it better to have cows in the herd for another lactation, or do we want to bring another higher genetic potential animal in? All these kinds of conversations that have to be, I think, sort of posed against ideas that explaining to consumers why we have only 3 lactations out of most of our cows can be a tough sell. So balancing that, this is one area that we can look at to try and improve longevity, kind of look at when the animals that are coming into our lactating herd are born, or cooling the dry cows.
I'm kind of keeping track as we've been talking here, the impacts of cooling a dry cow. And I'm getting increased milk production, 8 to 10 pounds, improved colostrum, improved immune function, calf performance, multiple generations, cow longevity. Has anybody taken any time and calculated the benefits of cooling cows, and then juxtapose that to what's it cost to dry or to cool a dry cow?
Tonight's last call question is brought to you by NiaSure Precision Release Niacin. Niacin is a proven vasodilator for heat stress reduction and a powerful antilipolytic agent for lowering high blood NEFA in transition cows. Protected with Balchem's proprietary encapsulation technology, you can be sure it is being delivered where and when your cows need it. Learn more at balchem.com/NiaSure.
You're up, Shaw.
I think actually it's a Dr. Dahl's question, but I can talk just a little bit so he can supplement. Dr. Dahl and Dr. DeVries actually did some calculation to look at the cooling dry cows, the economic benefit of cooling dry cows. I think there are different scenarios. First, if you have a barn already, you can just put a cow in. So in that situation, in state like Florida, Georgia, where the summer is really long, that's very beneficial, financially beneficial. And if you don't have a dry cow barn, and so it takes longer to get the investment back, but in a state like where summer is really long, it's still beneficial. In some states, if the summer is shorter, so that's if you don't have a barn, you have to build a barn for dry cows. So the investment probably is not going to get back really quickly. I don't remember exactly, but overall, Dr. correct me if I was wrong, it's how many $1 billion if we do not cool dry cow across the entire U.S.?
Yeah, it's about $1.5 billion estimate based on data from 4 or 5 years ago. I would say that when we first did it, first analysis that we did, we limited it to the impact on the cow in the next lactation. So it was just on the potential milk production response, nothing on reproduction, nothing on health, any of that. And there, as Shah pointed out, if you look around the country, average number of heat stress days was about 90 across the top 20 milk producing states. There it obviously varied, but it paid off if you were at that average pretty quickly in terms of putting up an actual new facility. Then when we kind of looked at subsequently the impact on the calf and added that in, then it kind of doubles the effect. And so I think that to me, it makes a lot of financial sense, and you're going to have a pretty fast payoff, probably within a year or two. If we're looking at return on investment, there's not many things we can do to manipulate management that are going to pay off as quickly as cooling those dry cows. When we look at the impact on the cow and then on the calf as well, and a couple of things to remember too is that all of our assumptions are based on the same number of calves being born every month of the year, which we know is not what happens, right? When are most calves born? We have a flush of calves, in the fall. So we have a lot more proportionally of our herd that's dry and potentially impacted by heat stress than most of our calculations would indicate. So that's an important factor to consider. The other thing is that I remember when I moved to Florida, most days in the summer, we would talk about high temperatures between 90 and 93 degrees. And we very rarely got over 95 degrees. Well, in the last 20 years, we've transitioned, we've moved so that we have a lot of days that we're consistently seeing 95, 96, 90, and for an extended period. And as many folks would say, well, that's Florida. Well, I don't think it's just Florida. I think that we're seeing elevations and consistent elevation and longer summers essentially around the country. And so all of our calculations are based on sort of older data and older assumptions that I think we're moving towards a hotter environment overall. And so they're probably very conservative.
Yeah. So the next question, and the answer is probably it depends, but what factors went into the calculation of the cost? So I heard new facilities, but were you assuming sprinkling systems, water cooling? What went into those calculations?
Yeah, so we sort of used commercial numbers to look at the cost of putting a new barn in, and then we varied that. Right, we essentially did a sensitivity analysis across different costs per stall basis to put a barn in with appropriate cooling measures, and that would have been soakers and fans, and then also varied it by the expected production responses. So we went from about 2 pounds a day more in the next lactation to 10 pounds a day. And again, across those various scenarios, and included all of the potential additional costs for, well, the cow's making more milk, she's eating more feed. Right? All those kinds of things were calculated in there as well. And it is hard to, talk about a place where we would not have a positive sort of response from a financial perspective to cooling those dry cows.
Mm-hmm.
Shah, what have you got coming up at the dairy science meetings? Anything on heat stress?
I think on the calf side, so it's pretty interesting. So I think a lot of people start to look at the calves related to heat stress, and so that part for me is very interesting. And also from a lactating cow standpoint, although we cool cows, but still we have a lot of stuff we need to learn, and a lot of stuff we don't understand. personally, our group is very interested in how heat stress affect the immunity, inflammation before and after disease. So I think that's some area we should also pay attention on. So I know in Florida, Dr. Dahl and Dr. Bromfield also work on how heat stress affect the metritis, and we're also interested in looking at how heat stress affect the pneumonia in calves and also the mastitis in lactating dairy cows. So I think this is some area, at least from my own perspective, is something I'm always interested in. Yeah, in that part related to heat stress. I'm looking forward to go to a dairy science meeting to see what other people do. So especially in these areas.
Yeah, interesting. Dr. Dahl, you going to have any papers, abstracts there?
We do. We have a few related to heat stress. One of them, testing in a commercial situation, some of these smart soakers and looking at the impact, particularly on water. Yeah. On the one hand, it's I don't want to steal my students' thunder, but it's a fairly boring abstract because we just compared the sort of conventional system to the smart soaker, and there's really no difference. They're just as good at cooling. The productivity was just as good in both groups, but it was less than half the water, which is a
That's big.
huge impact in those animals with that improved soaker system. The other area that we're working in is looking at general efficiency, but particularly related to methane output, and we'll have information on looking at methane intensity and yield in animals that are heat stressed during lactation, but also the cows that were heat stressed during the dry period, what they do sort of later in lactation. And as you might expect, those animals that are heat stressed at either time, but particularly in lactation, we see that even though their total methane output may be reduced when they're heat stressed because their intake is lower, the intensity is taking a huge hit. So higher production in those animals actually improves our greenhouse gas footprint because we're seeing that the amount of methane output is lower per unit of milk that those animals produce. So those are some of the things that we'll be reporting on at the ADSA meeting.
Yeah, good. It'll be here before you know it. Yeah. So I see they just flickered the lights. That means it is time for last call. And so what I'd like you guys to do is just kind of think of a couple key takeaways that you'd like the audience to remember from listening to this podcast. And Laura, if I could start with you, would appreciate it.
Yeah, of course, Scott. So I think for me, just listening to this podcast and having listened to the lecture too, is that the biggest takeaway for me is how long heat stress can impact a herd. And so if we think of a herd that isn't cooling their dry cows and starts today, that they will really still see those negative repercussions of heat stress in their dry cows for years to come. So it's going to take a few years of cooling the dry cows before we really see that whole herd being able to reach its potential.
Yeah. Great comments. Dr. Tao, what comments do you have for us?
So mine is very simple, just cool cows from dry off to calving.
Just do it.
Just something we always emphasize. And, I don't know about other places, at least in a lot of farms, once they build a barn, they tend to put a lactating cow into the barn because they want to increase the cow number. Sometimes they tend to forget about this far off cows. I do think this is a very important area we should focus on. So if there's something I hope people can remember, it's just to cool the entire dry period, not just the last 3 weeks of the gestation. So far off is important.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
Well, I was just gonna say that Laura, I agree with your comments. But another thing to think about is with our herds that are, maybe looking at using a lot of sexed semen, producing beef calves with half the herd, that type of thing. That's another factor in this overall equation. right? So what animals do we want to be cooling for the entire dry period versus the animals that are producing a calf that we're not going to retain ownership in, that is going to beef production? Maybe, we think about who we can fit in the barn, right? I'm always trying to think about the sort of application and getting stuff, at the farm level to work. So that's another factor that we might want to consider beyond the season that those animals are born in. But if we can only, cool so many dry cows, let's make sure that we're getting our cows that are bred to sex semen that are producing the heifers for our herd going forward, that they are more than adequately cooled. Because even though, as Laura said, it may take a while to come back from this, it doesn't mean you don't do it, right? You want to get started as soon as possible. And so that's one other thing that can maybe accelerate that improvement.
Yeah, great comments. Dr. Dahl, it's always great to have you. You're always a good guest. So thank you for stopping by here once again.
Sure.
Dr. Tao, welcome. Glad to have you for the first time. Hope to see you back here sometime.
Right.
And
thank you for having me.
Maybe. Yeah, all right. And Laura, great job as usual. Appreciate you coming by and spending some time with us, and to our loyal audience as always. Thanks for coming along with us on this little journey here. We hope you learned something. We hope you had some fun, and we hope to see you next time here at the Real Science Exchange, where it's always happy hour and you're always among friends.
We'd love to hear your comments or ideas for topics and guests, so please reach out via email at anh.marketing@balchem.com with any suggestions, and we'll work hard to add them to the schedule. Don't forget to leave a 5-star rating on your way out. You can request your Real Science Exchange t-shirt in just a few easy steps. Just like or subscribe to the Real Science Exchange and send us a screenshot along with your address and t-shirt size to anh.marketing@balchem.com. Balchem's Real Science Lecture Series of webinars takes place on the first Tuesday of every month, with the top research and nutrition topics that will impact your business. We also include small ruminant, monogastric, and companion animal-focused topics throughout the year. Visit balchem.com/realscience to see the upcoming topics and to register for future webinars. You can also access past webinars and search for the topics most important to you.